The infrared temperature gun trembled in Margaret Whitmore's perfectly manicured hand as she pointed it directly at the gleaming blue surface of her neighbor's backyard pool. 78.3 degrees? Unacceptable. Her lips curled into a thin smile that didn't reach her steel-gray eyes. She'd spent months documenting every single violation in Sunnyside Estates, and this pool, this glorious, illegally warm pool, would be her magnum opus of neighborhood regulation enforcement. Derek Rodriguez had no idea what was coming. For 3 years, Margaret, known to everyone in the neighborhood as Karen behind her back, had served as the most zealous member of the Sunnyside Estates Homeowners Association Board. Her reputation was built on meticulousness, an encyclopedic knowledge of every single bylaw's document, and a burning desire to maintain absolute order. The Rodriguez family had always been a thorn in her side. Their landscaping was precisely 2 inches taller than the approved height. Their mailbox, a wrought iron design that Derek had custom ordered, was half an inch wider than the sanctioned dimensions. And now this pool. Margaret adjusted her designer's sunglasses and tapped the temperature reading into her custom spreadsheet. She'd been tracking the pool's temperature for weeks, collecting evidence. The HOA bylaws were crystal clear about maximum pool temperatures, a regulation she herself had championed during last year's annual meeting. Most neighbors found her exhausting. The young couples whispered about her. The older residents tolerated her with forced smiles. But Margaret didn't care about being liked. She cared about rules. Her phone buzzed. A text from her fellow board member, Richard Thompson. Another complaint about the Rodriguez pool. Not just a complaint, she typed back. Concrete evidence of thermal violation. The morning sun cast long shadows across the meticulously trimmed lawns of Sunnyside Estates. Each house stood like a perfect soldier. Identical setbacks, uniform paint colors, not a single blade of grass out of place. And Margaret intended to keep it that way. She remembered how she'd risen to power on the HOA board. 3 years ago, after catching the previous board president allowing his grandson to park a camper van, temporarily, in his driveway, Margaret had launched a campaign of bureaucratic warfare. Endless emails, detailed reports, photographs documenting every single infraction. Now she was the board's most feared and respected member. No one dared challenge her interpretation of the bylaws. Derek Rodriguez would soon learn that crossing Margaret Whitmore was a mistake. She had documentation, she had regulations, and most importantly, she had an unshakable belief that she was always unequivocally right. Little did she know, Derek had been preparing for this moment far longer than she could imagine. The pool temperature was just the beginning of a battle that would reshape Sunnyside Estates forever. Margaret took another temperature reading, her fingers dancing across her smartphone screen. 78.4 degrees now. The evidence was mounting. Derek Rodriguez was a software engineer who understood systems and how to navigate them. When Margaret's first official complaint arrived, crisp and laser-printed, he didn't panic. He studied it. The certified mail sat on his kitchen counter, a pristine white envelope with the Sunnyside Estates HOA letterhead. His wife, Elena, rolled her eyes. She's at it again. But Derek saw opportunity where Elena saw harassment. He'd been collecting his own documentation for months, a digital portfolio carefully assembled with the precision of a man who knew exactly how to fight bureaucracy with its own weapons. The pool temperature violation was laughable. Margaret had cited an obscure bylaw about maximum water temperatures, claiming that anything above 78 degrees constituted a thermal nuisance that could potentially impact neighboring property values. Derek knew the real story was far more complicated. When they'd first moved into Sunnyside Estates 2 years ago, Derek and Elena had been warned about Margaret. The neighbors had shared hushed stories, how she forced the Hendersons to repaint their entire house because the shade of beige was 0.5 units off the approved color palette, how she'd measured lawn grass with a ruler and sent violation notices for quarter-inch discrepancies. What Margaret didn't know was that Derek had been collecting every single piece of communication from the HOA, every email, every notice, every ridiculous regulation. He created a comprehensive database, cross-referencing inconsistencies and tracking patterns. The pool temperature was just the latest in a long line of Margaret's increasingly absurd regulations, but this time, he was prepared. His fingers flew across the keyboard, drafting a response that would make Margaret rue the day she decided to challenge him. He knew the bylaws better than she realized, probably better than she did herself. Elena watched him, a mix of amusement and concern crossing her face. "You're not going to actually fight this, are you?" Derek's smile was calculated. "I'm going to do more than fight. I'm going to expose the entire system." The Rodriguez household was unlike the other homes in Sunnyside Estates. While most residents maintained a careful neutrality, avoiding confrontation with the HOA board, Derek saw bureaucratic overreach as a personal challenge. His work in software security had taught him that every system had vulnerabilities, and Margaret's HOA regime was riddled with them. He opened a folder labeled HOA Documented Inconsistencies, a meticulously organized collection of digital evidence, timestamps, screenshots, comparative analyses. Each file was a potential weapon in the battle brewing between him and Margaret Whitmore. The pool temperature complaint was just the first move in a chess game where Derek was several moves ahead. Margaret thought she was enforcing rules. Derek was about to show her what real rule enforcement looked like. Outside, the pool glistened minus 78.4 degrees of defiant perfection. The monthly HOA meeting was Margaret's stage, and she commanded it with the precision of a military general. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead in the community center's bland conference room, casting harsh shadows on the faces of reluctant neighborhood representatives. Richard Thompson, the board's vice president, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He'd been Margaret's loyal ally for years, but lately her tactics were becoming increasingly erratic. The Rodriguez pool temperature complaint was the latest example of her mounting obsessiveness. Item 7. Margaret announced, her voice cutting through the ambient murmur. Thermal nuisance complaint, Rodriguez residence, case number C2023-614. A collective groan rippled through the room. Most board members had learned to tune out Margaret's more extreme propositions, but something about this complaint felt different. Derek Rodriguez wasn't like the other homeowners who typically cowered under her scrutiny. Margaret clicked through a PowerPoint presentation she prepared with military-like precision. Infrared temperature readings, bylaw citations, detailed charts showing potential thermal impact on surrounding properties. Her presentation was a masterpiece of bureaucratic overreach. The pool in question, she declared, pointer trembling slightly with excitement, exceeds our community's established thermal comfort parameters by no less than 0.4 degrees Fahrenheit. Richard leaned over and whispered to Barbara Chen, the board's youngest member. She's lost her mind. Barbara suppressed a smile. Margaret had been targeting her landscaping business for months, claiming her commercial vehicle violated parking regulations. This was becoming a personal vendetta more than genuine community management. What Margaret didn't know was that Derek had already distributed a comprehensive email to every board member the previous night. His response wasn't just a defense, it was a calculated counterattack that would expose the inconsistencies in the HOA's enforcement. The first page of his report detailed 3 previous instances where Margaret had conveniently overlooked similar thermal violations to her friends and personal allies. Highlighted in bright yellow were screenshots of past communications, each one a potential nail in her bureaucratic coffin. Richard watched Margaret's presentation with growing unease. She was brilliant and dangerous. He'd supported her rise to power, believing her meticulous nature would bring order to the HOA. Now he was beginning to wonder if he'd helped create a monster. "Any questions?" Margaret asked, her voice sharp as a paper cut. Silence filled the room, but it was a charged silence, the kind that precedes a storm. Derek Rodriguez was waiting, not in the room, but watching. His digital evidence was about to transform this routine HOA meeting into something nobody expected. The fluorescent lights flickered again, as if sensing the impending confrontation. Margaret stood at the podium, triumphant and completely unaware that her carefully constructed world was about to unravel. The email arrived precisely at 8:17 a.m. simultaneously in every board member's inbox. Derek Rodriguez had orchestrated a digital symphony of exposure that would make even the most seasoned corporate whistleblower proud. Richard Thompson's hand trembled as he scrolled through the attachments, screenshots, timestamped communications, a forensic breakdown of Margaret Whitmore's HOA enforcement that made her look less like a vigilant community protector and more like a petty tyrant. The first attachment was a comparative analysis of pool temperature violations. Margaret had mysteriously overlooked similar infractions for 3 board members, each conveniently connected to her personal social circle. The Jameson family's pool ran consistently at 79.2 degrees. The Petersons maintained a steady 78.9 degrees. Yet only the Rodriguez pool had triggered her thermal warfare. But Derek's digital dossier went deeper. Financial records showed curious patterns of communication between Margaret and local contractors, subtle kickbacks, preferential treatment for home improvement projects. Each document was meticulously annotated, each connection carefully mapped. Lillian Rodriguez watched her husband work with a mixture of admiration and concern. "You're taking this further than just the pool," she observed. Derek's fingers never stopped typing. "This isn't about a pool. This is about systemic corruption." The HOA had always been Margaret's personal fiefdom. She transformed a simple neighborhood management role into a complex web of control, wielding bylaws like weapons and interpreting regulations to suit her personal agenda. What Derek had discovered went beyond mere temperature violations. He'd uncovered a network of small corruptions, minor infractions that individually seemed insignificant but collectively painted a damning picture of mismanagement. Most residents of Sunnyside Estates had learned to keep their heads down. Compliance was easier than confrontation. But Derek wasn't most residents. His background in software security had taught him that every system has vulnerabilities. Every fortress has a weakness, and Margaret's carefully constructed HOA regime was about to experience a total system breach. The next board meeting would be his moment, not just to defend against the pool temperature complaint, but to expose the entire mechanism of control Margaret had so carefully constructed. Richard Thompson stared at his computer screen, a bead of sweat forming on his forehead. He knew what was coming. The email wasn't just a defense, it was a declaration of war. Margaret had made a fundamental mistake. She'd chosen the wrong neighbor to push around. In the Rodriguez household, strategy was a way of life, and Derek was about to demonstrate exactly what that meant. Margaret's morning routine shattered the moment she opened her email. The first message was from the HOA's legal counsel, a tersely worded request for an emergency meeting to discuss potential procedural irregularities. She knew immediately. Derek Rodriguez had struck back. Her pristine home office with its color-coded filing systems and carefully organized binders of HOA regulations suddenly felt like a war room under siege. Margaret's hands shook as she scrolled through the digital evidence Derek had so meticulously compiled. The coffee she carefully brewed, Guatemalan single origin, precisely 198 degrees, went cold and forgotten. Years of careful maneuvering of building her reputation as the most fastidious HOA board member were unraveling with each click. Derek had done more than defend himself. He turned her own bureaucratic weapon against her. She remembered how she'd risen to power. 10 years ago, she'd been just another frustrated homeowner tired of neighbors who couldn't follow simple rules. The first time she'd successfully forced the Hendersons to repaint their house, she felt a rush of power unlike anything she'd experienced before. Now, everything was falling apart. The financial records were the most damning. Small kickbacks from local contractors, preferential treatment for board members' home improvements, subtle manipulations of the bylaws that benefited her inner circle. Derek had documented everything with the precision of a forensic accountant. Her phone rang. Richard Thompson's number. "We need to talk," he said, his voice devoid of its usual deference. Margaret knew what was coming. The board had tolerated her methods for years, but Derek Rodriguez had done something nobody had managed before. He'd exposed the entire system of control she so carefully constructed. Her reputation wasn't just at risk, it was about to be obliterated. The neighborhood she spent years controlling suddenly felt like a house of cards. Each regulation, each violation notice, each carefully crafted rule, they were all potential weapons now. And Derek had just arsenal of digital evidence that could destroy everything she built. Outside her window, Sunnyside Estates looked the same. Perfectly manicured lawns, identical mailboxes, uniform paint colors. But something had changed. The neighborhood's carefully maintained facade was about to crack. Margaret Whitmore had always believed in rules, in control, in the power of bureaucratic precision. Derek Rodriguez was about to show her the true meaning of those words. The emergency board meeting was nothing like Margaret had anticipated. Instead of her usual commanding presence, she found herself on the defensive, surrounded by board members who had suddenly developed spines. Richard Thompson sat at the head of the table, a stack of Derek Rodriguez's documentation spread before him like damning evidence at a trial. Barbara Chen, typically quiet, now looked at Margaret with a mix of disappointment and barely concealed anger. "Let's discuss these financial irregularities," Richard began, his voice calm but loaded with intention. Margaret's carefully maintained composure began to crack. She always believed her meticulous nature protected her, that her attention to detail would shield her from any potential scrutiny. But Derek had turned her own weapon against her, precision documentation that exposed every single inconsistency. The first exhibit was a series of contractor invoices, subtle kickbacks, preferential treatment, small manipulations that individually seemed insignificant but collectively painted a picture of systematic abuse of power. "I've always done what's best for the community," Margaret attempted, her voice wavering. Barbara slid a printed email across the table. "Really? Because this suggests otherwise." The email detailed a conversation where Margaret had pressured a local painting company to give her nephew's new business preferential treatment. In exchange, she'd ensure the company received multiple HOA contracts. It was textbook conflict of interest, exactly the type of violation she ruthlessly pursued against other homeowners. Derek Rodriguez wasn't even in the room, but his presence was overwhelming. He transformed from a mere defendant to the primary architect of Margaret's potential downfall. Years of controlling the neighborhood through fear and bureaucratic manipulation were crumbling. The board members who had once quietly supported her, or at least tolerated her methods, were now looking at her with critical eyes. "I was protecting the community's standards," Margaret insisted, but her voice lacked its usual steel. Richard Thompson leaned forward. "By creating your own system of personal gain, that's not protection. That's corruption." The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Margaret, who had built her reputation on enforcing every minutiae of HOA regulations, was now being judged by the very system she helped create. Each piece of evidence Derek had compiled was a precision-guided missile targeting her credibility. Outside the meeting room, Sunnyside Estates remained unchanged. Perfectly trimmed lawns, identical mailboxes, uniform house colors. But something fundamental had shifted. Margaret Whitmore was about to learn that the rules she'd wielded so ruthlessly could just as easily be turned against her. The fallout was swift and merciless. Within 48 hours of the emergency board meeting, Margaret Whitmore found herself not just removed from the HOA board, but facing potential legal consequences for her years of systematic manipulation. Her phone became a wasteland of disconnected relationships. Neighbors who had once feared her now openly discussed her downfall. The Sunnyside Estates WhatsApp group, once a place she carefully monitored and controlled, erupted with conversations about accountability and transparency. Alina Rodriguez watched her husband with a mixture of pride and concern. "Are you satisfied?" she asked. Derek's response was measured. This was never about winning. This was about exposing a broken system. The pool temperature complaint that had started everything now seemed almost comically insignificant. What Derek had uncovered was a complex network of small corruptions that had been choking the community for years. Margaret hadn't just bent rules, she'd systematically created personal fiefdom within the HOA. Local media caught wind of the story. A small suburban neighborhood's internal conflict became a case study in local governance gone wrong. Investigative reporters began digging, and each layer they uncovered revealed more about Margaret's years of calculated control. Richard Thompson, feeling both guilt and relief, became an unexpected whistleblower. He provided additional documentation that further substantiated Derek's claims. The board was being completely restructured, with new bylaws designed to prevent any single member from wielding too much power. Margaret's world compressed. Her carefully maintained social circles disintegrated. The neighborhood she controlled for years now saw her as a cautionary tale, a bureaucratic tyrant finally brought to justice. She hadn't just lost her position. She'd lost her entire identity. The Rodriguez pool remained at 78.4 degrees, a subtle reminder of where this journey had begun. Derek had proven that sometimes the most powerful weapon against bureaucratic overreach is meticulous documentation and unwavering determination. Sunnyside Estates would never be the same. The uniform mailboxes looked slightly different now. The perfectly trimmed lawns seemed to breathe with a newfound freedom. A community that had been suffocated by one person's control was slowly rediscovering its humanity. And it all started with a pool temperature reading.